Probably since the beginning of recorded history, human beings have tried to come up with an answer to the problem of suffering. Why do we suffer? Why is there pain in the world? Most of us have been there or probably will be there at some point. It seems at times suffering can come at us out of the blue. An illness comes that we never expected, especially when we're in our prime or rather healthy. The spouse becomes unfaithful, or we experience financial ruin because of somebody else's poor decisions. So it's very real, it affects us all, and philosophers and theologians throughout the centuries have tried to come up with an answer to solve the problem, or at least to figure out what are we supposed to do about it? How do we deal with it? You go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, the great philosophers, the Stoics. Their response to the question of suffering was that one should detach themselves from the way things are. In other words, the problem is that we expect something, and it doesn't turn out that way. So if you let go of both the good and the bad, in that detachment from things, you will find happiness and freedom from pain. The Buddhist, the first noble principle of Buddhism is that life is suffering. Life is suffering. That's a very profound statement, very insightful statement. It tells us a lot. Not that every moment of life is painful, but that desire can never really be satisfied, so that leads to suffering. So all of Buddhism is an attempt to solve that problem. The Buddhist would say through meditation and the negation of self, we blow out the candle of desire. We extinguish the candle of desire. That's the meaning of nirvana. And so if you stop desiring, you will stop suffering. Plato, the great philosopher, dealt with it in a different way. So we deal with suffering by meditating on the eternal dimensions to understand the realm of the forms. And what that meant was that life is full of all sorts of vagaries, but we can only come to understand what's happening if we focus on the eternal, because all of these things that are passing correspond to something that is permanent, something that is eternal, and if we make our way through to the realm of the forms, you find a kind of peace. And there are a whole lot more philosophies and religious traditions that try to offer some very keen insights into the problem of suffering. But Christianity understands the problem too, and I think offers us the best answer to it. And it's not in Stoic detachment, it's not in Buddhist annihilation of the self, nor in that Platonic journey upward into the eternal forms. And the gospel that we just heard from the 16th chapter of Matthew focuses on this issue. It hits it head on. It gives us the answer to the problem of suffering. Now, you have to go back and remember last week we heard in the same chapter, Jesus declared to Peter, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and I give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." And now just a moment later, a few verses later, the entire scene shifts. It gets blown up. After Jesus declaring his intention to found his church upon Peter, he now shows them what it means to be church, what this new life would really be. And so he tells them he's going to Jerusalem to suffer, to be killed, and on the third day to rise. Now, just imagine the psychological trauma of this statement. Peter was probably feeling pretty good about himself, as were the other disciples. They were going to be princes in this new kingdom. They were going to have authority and power. They were going to be able to do the things God wanted them to do. And after this, Jesus makes this really deeply disturbing statement that seems to be at odds with what had just come before. So Peter is thinking, suffer and die. No way. You are God's anointed. You are the Christ. And then Peter rebukes Jesus. Now, for Peter, this just couldn't be right. The glory of the kingdom that he was thinking Jesus was coming to bring couldn't demand suffering and death. So he rebukes Jesus. God forbid, Lord, this should happen to you. And he probably does it out of love, out of friendship for Jesus. And we have to admit, Peter speaks for us as well. Because when we really come to terms with suffering, and we're asked to accept it, we're asked to embrace it, we often have that same reaction. No way, Lord, this can't be your will, this can't be the way that it should supposed to be. You have to be wrong about this. And you know, when you are rebuking Jesus, you are probably in a very bad spiritual space. But we can take some comfort in Peter's example, realizing what he had to struggle with in order to understand what Jesus was talking about. And so Jesus isn't having any of this. It's not about worldly power and glory. And so he really says the most shocking statement in all of the Gospels to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Kind of shocking. I mean, he had just given Peter the keys to the kingdom. He had told him the gates of hell would not prevail against it. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. You are the rock. And now, can you imagine? He is being called Satan. Satan. It's a rather extraordinary. You see, suffering and death were not on Peter's agenda. Suffering is probably not on our agenda as well, but it comes. And Jesus is proposing to them the only valid solution to suffering, to evil, the only valid path to glory, to joy. And it's a high paradox. Pain and suffering will be overcome, but not by stoic resignation. That's not the way of Jesus. It's not the biblical way. Jesus is filled with passion for justice. Nor is this the Buddhist negation of self. No, in Christianity, you find yourself. Nor is this by any means a Platonic escape into the realm of the forms. None of that works. So what is Jesus proposing as the solution? The solution is the sacrifice of the self in love. The solution to the problem of suffering and pain is the sacrifice of the self in love. And that's what Jesus announces to his disciples in this gospel passage. He tells them he's going to Jerusalem to give himself away. And we know once there at the Last Supper, he takes the bread and says, "This is my body, which will be broken for you." He takes the cup and says, "This is the cup of my blood, which will be shed for many." Jesus will sacrifice himself in love for the other. And in this, he will come to life, and he will also become the source of life for others. This is a difficult but unique path that is not like the others. Look what happens when we simply sign ourselves with the sign of the cross, an easy way to remember the meaning of all this. The first part spells the letter I, and then the second part simply crosses it out. And the only way that we can overcome pain and suffering is to give ourselves away in love. So in the measure that Peter didn't get it, he became a Satan, a stumbling block, an opponent of Jesus. And to the measure that we don't get it, we become an opponent of Christ as well. And so now, having rebuked Peter, Jesus gathers the other disciples and he pronounces the formula for all of this. Words that we should pay close attention to, words that should always be close to our hearts. He says, "Whoever wishes to follow me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." The path of discipleship is the path of suffering in love. And that means it will be a path of suffering, true, but it's the only way to get past the suffering into real life. "For who wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." So if you want to be happy, don't be a Stoic. Don't follow the path of negation of self. Don't become a Platonist. Follow the teaching of the gospel. Lose your life in love, and you will find it. Give your life away as a gift, and you will come to resurrection.